So Matthew 5, 1 to 9. The Beatitudes. Now, when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. This is the word of the Lord.
My fault. That's entirely my fault. Early in my high school years, I fell in love. But it wasn't in love with a woman. It was in love with Dr. Dre. Now, most of you guys may know Dr. Dre as a purveyor of high-priced headphones, but I knew Dr. Dre as a gangster rapper. I remember, it's very ironic if you think about it, a little Chinese boy in the suburbs of Long Island spending an entire summer listening to a gangster from East LA. But that's what I did. One of my good friends, Mike Lau, who's a police officer now, and we just sat there on repeat, listening and memorizing the lyrics of each of Dr. Dre's songs. One of the themes that came out, though, is Dr. Dre was an angry man. There were a lot of people that he had beef with, and one of them was a guy named Eazy-E, right? We won't get into all the details of the beef, but there were enough rhymes disrespecting Eazy-E that I knew that they didn't like each other. In fact, this conflict continued on all the way until Eazy-E's death, at which point Dr. Dre regretted how that had blown up into such a big thing. Now, if you follow rap at all, you'll know that there was a period of time when East Coast rap and West Coast rap did not get along. It got so bad that all of you will have definitely heard of Tupac and Biggie. Yeah, what happened to them? Yeah, either they died or, according to some theories, they're in the Bahamas or the what is that called? Bermuda Triangle. Yeah, so we don't know for sure, but their conflict was great as well. Now, some of you guys may think, oh, you see, that's why I don't listen to rap. That's why I don't let my kids listen to rap, because of all the anger, all the conflict that takes place. No. This is not just with rappers. How many of you guys have heard of Aaron Burr? What is he famous for? What? Did I hear pow pow? Okay, that is correct. Aaron Burr, at the time, I believe, was vice president. And he had a duel with Alexander Hamilton, who was the secretary of the Treasury. He actually killed Alexander Hamilton. Now, you may think, wow, that is why I don't want to be famous, because when it comes to conflict, it leads to bad things, and it's mainly because you're famous. No. Think back to Thanksgiving. Remember Auntie Tina, who made that delicious beef that everyone complimented? But then, remember Auntie Joyce, who came along and said, she puts MSG in that food? And then remember how Auntie Tina found out, and they haven't talked ever since? No? You don't remember that? I made that up. But it doesn't matter whether or not Auntie Tina and Auntie Joyce actually existed. There's enough humanity there. There's enough connection points where you'll realize that that's something that might as well have happened, and that's something that happens to all of us. The point is this. Conflict is inevitable in our fallen, broken world. People get into beefs, people get into fights, people get into arguments, disagreements all the time. And so when we come to Matthew chapter 5, the 7th of our Beatitudes, and Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. You realize that Jesus is calling for something radical. Because natural human responses, as natural fallen human beings, we will have conflicts. But yet he's saying, I want something of you that's different from the rest of the world. Oftentimes when it comes to conflict, there's a fight or flight response. Either we say we're going to get into it, or we're going to run away from it. But in this beatitude, Jesus says, I want something completely different, something altogether better than what is there right now. And if you look at this beatitude and you see him talking about how blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because who is the ultimate peacemaker? Is it not Jesus Christ, who came down to earth, who made peace between man, woman, all of humanity, and God? As one commentator says, signing the peace treaty in his own blood, so that all of us who respond in faith might be reconciled and be able to make peace with God. So what he's saying here, as he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God, is, hey, in a similar sort of way, those of us who call ourselves Christians, who follow in his ways, will start to look like him, be called sons of God. What does that mean? Think about it, right? What does it mean to be called a son of somebody? It means you take on the characteristics of that person. I have two sons named CJ and Noah, Meatball, right? We won't talk about Meatball right now, but have you guys ever met CJ? Who does he look like? Exactly. When people look at him, they know, you don't need a paternity test. This is my son. Because that dude is mini-me. And he's taken on the physical characteristics of his father. Poor guy. And the point is, in a similar sort of way, those of us who are Christians, as we live as peacemakers, we take on those characteristics of our Father, of Christ himself, who was the ultimate peacemaker. Today, we're going to be looking at what this peacemaking looks like and how do we go about it. And I want to say at the beginning here that all of everything that I'm going to say is not original to me. In fact, to be honest, I haven't had an original thought in years. But on this particular day, the material comes from a work by a man named Ken Sande, who wrote this book called The Peacemaker. Wait, it's either The Peacemaker or Peacemakers. I'm sorry, I blanked out. But it doesn't matter. He wrote this wonderful book, and it's actually blossomed into an entire ministry known as Peacemaker Ministries, where they'll come in to churches, and they'll mediate, and then they help people in conflict. And so today we're going to look at what this peacemaking looks like and what this peacemaking actually is not. So let's first look at what peacemaking is not. Peacemaking is not fight or flight. Peacemaking is not peace faking or peace breaking. First, peace faking, right? Sometimes we have more interest in avoiding a conflict than actually in resolving it. And it's common in the church, very common in the Asian American church, where harmony is valued above almost all else, and some would even think that conflict itself is wrong or dangerous. So as a response, we often show some peace faking, and we choose to run, flight, escape. People use escape responses when they're more interested in avoiding those unpleasant people or situations than actually resolving those differences, right? And the simplest way we might escape is by denial. Denial is an escape in which we pretend that a problem doesn't exist at all. I remember one time when I was in seminary, and we had this group project, and one person suggested this idea, and the idea was pretty bad. And then I don't know what happened, but I just started laughing, and I was like, "That's a terrible idea." I guess hashtag no filter, right? That was my problem. I just kind of said it, and it was blunt, and I could tell like he was very upset. And I was like, "Oh man, I didn't mean to hurt you. and so later on, I went up to him to try to apologize and say, hey, I didn't mean that, or, well, I shouldn't have done it in that way. But when I came and I went to talk to him, he said, oh, no, we're cool, you're the best. No, nothing's wrong here. And it was so weird. I thought like I had entered into like a dream world, because it wasn't anything that had happened like 5 minutes ago. But yet here was like the perfect example of denial. That instead of entering into the conflict, instead of addressing and resolving and even allowing for any kind of resolution to take place, the person escaped from the conflict by pretending that the problem doesn't exist, never existed. Now, another way that we might escape from a conflict is actual flight, to run away. This might take the form of pulling away from a relationship, quitting a job, filing for divorce, or changing churches. Now, sometimes flight might be a legitimate response in extreme circumstances. But in most cases, it actually just postpones a proper solution to a problem. Oftentimes we might say, this person hurt me. I'm not going to interact with that person. I'm going to pretend this person doesn't exist. I'm going to justify it by saying that I'm just trying to save face. And the problem is, though, we value face so much that we have difficulty admitting our wrong, or that a wrong has been done. Peacemaking is not a détente. It's not pretending that nothing is wrong. It's not running away from a problem. Jesus disturbed the peace when it was necessary. Finally, the most extreme form of peace faking is actually suicide. When people lose all hope in resolving a conflict, they might seek to escape from the situation, make a desperate cry for help by attempting to take their own life. Now, let me say just here that suicide is never an appropriate way to deal with conflict. So some of us may decide, instead of peacemaking, we would be peace faking. But others of us are all the way on the other extreme. Instead of peace faking and running from the problem or denying it, we are peace breakers. And that is, we're people who believe that when there's a fight, we're going to win it. That it is a zero-sum game in which there's always a winner, there's always a loser, so why don't I be the one who wins? So when this happens, we start to view conflict as a contest, a chance to assert our rights, to control others, or take advantage of the situation. And there's some attack responses that we generally have. There's one of three things that we do. One, we might assault. Some people try to overcome an opponent by using various forms of force. Maybe it's through words, verbal attacks, gossip, slander, or just downright verbal abuse. Sometimes it resorts to physical violence or damaging a person financially, professionally. Attacks always makes the conflict worse. Other times, we might get into litigation. Now, some conflicts might need to be taken before a judge, but lawsuits usually damage relationships. And it doesn't make Christians look good. And it often fails to achieve any kind of justice. And that's why Christians are told in the Bible to make every effort to settle their differences within the church rather than through civil courts. Perhaps the biggest type of peace breaking, and I guess the hardest and the most extreme, is murder. Right? In some cases, people get so desperate to win an argument that they try to kill those who oppose them. Now, most of us, hopefully all of us, would not actually kill somebody, but all of us can stand guilty of murder in God's eyes when we might harbor anger or contempt or hatred toward other people. One person said it to me like this: when it comes to peace breaking, it's a little bit like passing gas, right? You feel better but everyone else feels a lot worse. One time, early on in our dating life, right before we got married, Connie and I attended a marriage conference. And at the beginning of the conference, I remember one of the things that the speaker told us to say to one another. We were supposed to look at each other's eyes and say to each other, "You are not my enemy." So, of course, we're engaged, so I'm blowing into her ear. I'm like, "You're not my enemy," right? It was not hard at all. But as I looked around, I saw that there were couples who actually couldn't say it. That things had gotten so bad, so hard, so difficult between the two of them that they had a hard time seeing their spouse, the person who was supposed to be the closest person outside of Jesus Christ, as anything but an enemy. But that's what happens if we refuse to enter into peacemaking, if we peace fake or peace break over a period of time. The relationship deteriorates and gets worse and worse and worse. So things never get better if we peace fake and escape. It never gets better if we peace break and enter into attacking. So how do we go about peacemaking, though? I'm going to show us 4 G's that talk about peacemaking. And I think that the biggest thing, if you can come away with anything at all from today, is to come away with a sense that peacemaking actually is an opportunity. Conflict isn't naturally a bad thing, but an opportunity. It can become an opportunity to glorify God. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, above all else, do everything for the glory of God, right? And so the 4 G's are glorify God, get the log out of your own eye, gently restore, and go and be reconciled. Number 1, glorify God. Now the first 2, before you enter even into any kind of conversation with somebody else, the first 2 deal with ourselves. And the first part is glorifying God. It's for us to answer, how can I please and honor the Lord in this situation? For many of us, it's important to realize that this is an opportunity to glorify God. That we can serve other people, either by bearing their burdens or speaking the truth in love. And it's also an opportunity for us to glorify God by growing to be like Christ through confession of sin, turning from attitudes that promote fighting and conflict. Unfortunately, a lot of times with conflicts, with people getting into fights, the problem is we don't think first and foremost, how can I honor and please God in this situation? There might be some of that, but then above all those other things is this sense that I want to be right. I want to be respected. I want to be loved. And when there's so much of me in all of this, there's not enough room for God to be glorified. If there's a choice between glorifying yourself or glorifying God, unfortunately, most of us choose to glorify ourselves. We may choose to say, hey, I want to come away looking good and not like the villain here. But in order to glorify God, sometimes we have to accept the fact that we will be misunderstood, misrepresented, and just maligned. Think about Jesus. Through all the interactions with the religious leaders, there were points in times in which he knew that what they were saying about him was not right. But yet, his primary purpose wasn't to do damage control for himself so that everyone thought he was a good guy. His ultimate purpose was, I want to make much of God so that people would honor him. So that's number one for us. How can I please God and honor the Lord in this situation? Number two is get the log out of your own eye. One of the most challenging things of peacemaking comes in Matthew 7:5 when Jesus says, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. This is saying that instead of thinking that this problem is another person's problem, why don't you take a personal inventory and see where you may be at fault here? Now, there are two kinds of logs that we might need to look at when dealing with conflict. First, you need to ask if there's an attitude shift that needs to take place within yourself. Whether you had a critical, negative, overly sensitive attitude that brought about this conflict. One of the best ways to do that is just in meditating and asking God, Lord, where do I need to own up to this part of it? I remember once there was a brother in the church that had gotten into a big conflict with some other Christians within the church. Now, I wasn't directly involved in it, so it was a little easier to talk to him. Things had gotten so bad that it had taken a huge emotional toll on him. He had started seeing a counselor in order to just kind of work through some of those issues. And during one of our conversations, he said that, he started sensing a breakthrough that had taken place. And I was like, okay, what happened? And he said, I realized for me, I didn't want them to win. I didn't want them to win. And I guess it was a very small thing. If we hear it, it doesn't sound like much. But for him, there was an attitude that had become a block to resolving the conflict. Now, it was more important for him to not come away feeling like a loser than simply to find a peaceful resolution to the entire thing. So, for us, getting the log out of our own eye might mean examining our own attitude. But there's a second kind of log that we have to deal with, and that's actual sinful words and actions. Sometimes it's hard for us. When we're in the middle of a conflict, we can only see what's happening to us, what people are doing to us, and not really wondering about our own part in it. And here's where brothers and sisters who care about you, I know on Friday we talked about safe people. Here's what safe people can do for you. As you enter into something difficult, a conflict that you're trying to navigate through, getting a log out of your eye might mean just talking to someone that you trust so that you get a brother or sister who can come back and tell you, hey, actually, it's not exactly how you see it. Someone who can speak honestly and say, I think that, your own attitude or what you've done up to this point has something to do with it as well. And so it's helping us to own up and face up to our part of the conflict. As we identify these ways in which we've wronged somebody, it's important that we admit it. We confess. And we actually go and own up to that behavior in resolving it. So that's getting the log out of your own eye. So first is glorifying God. Second is getting the log out of your own eye. Number 3 is gently restore. Now, when we think about conflict resolution, those of us familiar with the Bible will know that the passage that most people go to in conflict resolution comes in Matthew 18. And they think of go and confront that brother, right? Sometimes when we think about going and confronting that brother, it's almost like we lay out all the evidence and they just need to repent. But yet, if you look at that passage in context, immediately before it, we'll see that actually the passage before it deals with Jesus going to look for the lost sheep, leaving the 99, in order to bring that one back. And as you see it, you see a gentleness to it, a care and a love, a kindness, the work of a shepherd. It's not the work of condemnation that Jesus is talking about when we talk about confrontation. It's the work of restoration that he's talking about. We're trying to win a brother or sister back. We're trying to not win a conflict, but we're trying to make peace. So here, when it comes to gently restoring, keeping that in mind, sometimes the conflict itself might never even get to the other person. Because a lot of conflicts that happen are so small, so minuscule, that we're called to overlook it. Sometimes somebody might say something to you, And it hurts or it offends. But sometimes it's so small it's not worth dwelling over or confronting. In those cases, you just overlook it. Now, how can we tell if something is small or big? Let me give you 4 questions to ask yourself as you think about how you might figure out whether this is something that you should actually confront and deal with. Number 1, is the offense seriously dishonoring God? Number 2, has it permanently damaged a relationship? Number 3, is it seriously hurting other people? And number 4, is it seriously hurting the offender himself? If you answer yes to any of those questions, then the offense is too big and too serious to just let go and overlook. But if you answer no, then it's something that you ought to just let it go, let it pass. For those cases in which you do answer yes and you say, we need to make this work, then God commands you to go and talk to the offender privately, lovingly about the situation. As you do, remember to pray for your own heart, for humility, for wisdom. Also, plan out what you're going to say so that as you go into it, you're not just rambling, but you've played out the scenario in your own mind and you've thought of a way in which you would want someone to say those words to you as well. Think about what the reaction might be and plan appropriate responses. Choose the right time, right place. Talk to the person whenever possible. Don't use email, please. Yeah. Assume the best about the other person. Listen carefully. Speak words that build up. Ask for feedback. And recognize your own limits. Because sometimes by the end of all this, you got to realize that only God can change hearts. Sometimes one conversation is all that's needed. And the conflict is over and things are restored. But other times, it doesn't get resolved. Don't give up. Think about what was said, what was done. Look for ways to follow up on that conversation. Sometimes it helps to bring another along, to ask for advice. Sometimes it may be necessary in order that the conflict gets resolved, that it becomes something where a third party comes and mediates and arbitrates. But in the end, the goal here is to gently restore and not condemn. So gently restore. Finally, number 4, the 4th G, go and be reconciled. This is speaking of forgiveness. For us, as people who have experienced the greatest forgiveness in the world, God calls us to grant that same type of forgiveness to the people that have hurt us. Forgiveness is easy in principle, but very difficult when it happens to us. But ask God to help you in this process of forgiveness. And forgiveness means more than just, I forgive you, but I don't want anything to do with you. Forgiveness means, yes, I believe that it hurt. And yes, it's going to be a process to reconcile. But let's work together so that this relationship can be restored. In the end, the cost of peacemaking is high, but the cost of not peacemaking is even higher. As I close, I'd like to quote St. Francis of Assisi, who had this one prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. Amen. Oh, that was my prayer. I don't know if that means... Okay. So funny.